To the GIs fighting in the Vietnam War, it was a vital lifeline, providing food, ammunition, medical assistance, and fire support. In just a few years of operation, it was the difference between life and death to thousands of men. The Huey helicopter.
The Vietnam War was the Huey War. It was not a ground war. It was a helicopter war.
Vietnam was a brutal conflict. Huey gunships changed US Army tactics and the way modern wars are fought, as their lethal guns wrought havoc on the Viet Cong.
They considered us to be the mortal enemy because they'd seen what we'd done to them with those Gatling guns, and they hated us.
The Huey not only revolutionized the US Army's thinking, it changed the face of aviation forever. Using rare archive film and color reenactments, Battle Stations goes right inside the Huey helicopter, shows its role in combat and the everyday do-or-die existence of its crews. Helicopter development dates back to the early part of the 20th century, when the first rotary wing flight took place. Full-scale development soon began to attract many flight enthusiasts, including Igor Sikorsky, a Russian immigrant to America who in the 1930s managed to get his rotary machine in the air. At the same time, a brilliant young American engineer, Arthur Young, was also experimenting with rotary wing aircraft. Using models, he discovered that independently hinged blades follow the movement of the mast, and by fitting a stabilizer bar to the mast, the performance improved dramatically. In 1941, Young and another brilliant engineer, Bartram Kelly, took the initiative to demonstrate their new model to Lawrence D. Bell, founder of the Bell Aircraft Company.
Two gentlemen, young kids, called and said they'd like to come and talk to him. That was Art Young and Bart Kelly. They had a model helicopter. They plugged in the wall, had a rotor on it, and they could guide the thing, and they landed on Larry Bell's desk. He was absolutely amazed.
Larry Bell agreed to build two full-scale prototypes, designated the Model 30. Arthur Young is seen here lifting one off the ground for the first time. The project was centered in an old garage in Gardenville, New York. Here, Floyd Carlson, a Bell test pilot, tested the Model 30 for several months, making various adjustments until it crashed during a test run. But Bell and his team forged ahead with development. By 1943, an improved second prototype was ready to be tested. Its first passenger was Larry Bell, seen here eager to demonstrate his machine for the camera. During World War II, the Germans and Allies still considered the helicopter unproven technology, and only limited resources were devoted towards tests. But Larry Bell, whose company had grown considerably during the war, building fixed-wing fighters and bombers, had the vision to see the helicopter's potential. He was excited by the concept of vertical takeoff and the flexibility it gave compared to planes. To prove the point, Bell's favorite demonstration was for his helicopter to land on the palm of the hand.
Larry Bell was a legend. He was a man of foresight, a man of integrity, and had tremendous faith in the engineers. If they said they could do something, they could do it.
Arthur Young and his team built a third aircraft for Bell, the Model 47. It was an instant success, becoming the first commercially certified helicopter. More significantly for Bell, it became the workhorse of the US military. The US Army first deployed helicopters in large numbers during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Their primary role was for scouting and medical evacuation. On these flimsy flying machines, the wounded were carried precariously on stretchers strapped to the side of the helicopter. It was here that the MASH units, or Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, would create the first helicopter legends. Korea had provided the US Army with much valuable information on the use of the helicopter in war and its possible effect in future conflicts.
The integration of helicopters in the place of ground vehicles to permit units to do recon, to maneuver, to do fire support. In other words, of everything that happened in combat by the use of air mobility. And the helicopter was so key to that, it was just a natural answer to the Army's requirement.
After the Korean War ended, the Army asked American manufacturers to design a new utility helicopter wide enough to carry a stretcher inside the fuselage and with an 8,000-pound payload. At the time, helicopters were powered by piston engines. But research had begun on a new gas turbine engine. With their lighter weight and considerable increase in power, gas turbines held a strong advantage over the outdated piston engine. Running on gas turbines also meant the engine could be mounted on top of the fuselage, allowing more valuable cabin space inside the craft. Bell's engineers developed a turbine-powered utility helicopter, the UH-40. The United States Army was impressed and awarded Bell a contract.
We had a good design team. We had Bart Kelly as our leader, and we had some other key engineers that were running the show. They had a lot of maintenance experience, they had a lot of field experience, and we had pilots that lived flying, and they knew what the aircraft ought to do.
Bell's new helicopter was originally called the Iroquois by the U.S. Army.
When it went into the production phase, they called it the H helicopter U utility 1. So then that was HU, and the GIs put the name Huey on it from Huey, and that's how I got the name Huey.
The nickname stuck. The Army was keen to integrate the Huey into a new strategy of air mobility and immediately recruited a new generation of warrant officer pilots. Men who entered the Army specifically to fly helicopters under a far-sighted program that began in 1951. The new program, which lasted 9 months, gave recruits without college degrees the opportunity to become helicopter pilots. All they needed was the intelligence and desire to fly.
In all of my life, people have asked me about how do you fly a helicopter. I've always tried to come up with a nice analogy about, well, how flying a helicopter is a lot like. And then you're stuck because there's not really anything a lot like it. You must use both hands and both feet simultaneously, and you have to move them in a variety of directions. Some are dependent on the other and some are not. The left hand is the collective, which controls going up and down. On your right hand, you have a cyclic stick, which makes the aircraft nose go up and down or back and forth and left and right. The trick comes when you do what's called hovering, and that's stopping a helicopter in mid-air, and that requires the feet.
New pilots were quick to grasp the potential of the Huey over other helicopters.
We trained at Mineral Wells, Texas, and I flew a Hughes helicopter there. And then the last 2 months at Fort Rucker, Alabama, we started flying the Huey. And it was like a Cadillac compared to these smaller things that we used to fly.
But it was far from a smooth ride for Bell. The US government, now under pressure from other manufacturers, proposed that Bell should let other companies share in building the massive numbers of Hueys it needed.
We told them it wouldn't work. We tried it, and it was just going to be a waste of money. What we would do is give every state of the Union a portion of subcontracting. And we used to have a great big map of the United States, and each state was colored with how much money it got. And that's the way we kept the program a sole source at Bell.
As the first Hueys entered service with the Army, America pledged its support to the people of South Vietnam in their war against communism. the war in which it would become a weapon of legend was about to begin. In the spring of 1962, the first Hueys were sent to assist the people of South Vietnam, locked in a brutal struggle with communist insurgents. Vietnam had been a French colony until 1954, but when the French were finally driven out after a long war of independence, the victors could not agree on who should rule. The country was divided by international agreement into Communist North Vietnam and the Democratic Republic of South Vietnam. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the Communists rejected partition. In retaliation, they created the National Liberation Front, known as the Viet Cong, to wage a guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese army. Originally, the American government only intended to send military advisors to support South Vietnam, but it soon became clear that unless they undertook major combat missions themselves, the South would not survive.
We have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
By 1965, large numbers of American combat troops began pouring into South Vietnam. In the capital, Saigon, the Viet Cong retaliated by stepping up their bombing campaign. The Communists also controlled much of the countryside, where their hidden network provided food, ammunition, and refuge for their fighters. These secret Viet Cong cells were almost impossible to detect. The terrain in Vietnam was another major obstacle. The impenetrable jungle and high mountains made the ground movement of large numbers of troops virtually impossible. It was in these conditions that the mobility of the helicopter became essential. But for the newly arrived pilots, flying in Vietnam for the first time was a shock.
I just couldn't really believe it was happening to me, and I hadn't flown a Huey in over a month. And the first thing they did is put me in a loaded gunship and made me go fly a traffic pattern. And I nearly crashed because I had never flown one loaded like this. It was too dangerous in flight school. And that's my first impression, that I wasn't as good as I thought I was.
In Vietnam, the majority of Hueys were used for utility work. These were known as slicks and were each capable of transporting 8 fully armed troops. Slicks had a 4-man crew, the pilot and co-pilot, a door gunner, and a crew chief who had 2 different roles.
On the ground, naturally, you're a mechanic. You're responsible for daily inspections, which you're looking for obvious things that are wrong with the helicopter. When you were in the air, you were actually just a door gunner. However, we sat on the left-hand side, the crew chiefs did, because the instrument panel up front was offset. I could look between the pilot's seat from my cubby hole right there at the back, and I could read all the engine instruments and monitor things.
On slicks, the regular door gunner sat on the right-hand side.
The toughest part about being a door gunner is that so many people depended on us. And you had to be alert all the time. I mean, you had to be looking everywhere and listening, because, you know, when a bullet goes off around you, it makes a popping noise. And that's the first thing you start looking for, a muzzle blast. And so you're not just flying through the air doing nothing. You're constantly observing the ground.
The Viet Cong soon learned to aim their automatic weapons at these slow-moving troop transports. With helicopter losses mounting at the landing zones, it became clear the slicks needed more than their own door gunners to suppress enemy fire. The need for an armed gunship to act as escort had become a matter of life or death. Many B-model Hueys were immediately converted into gunships. A variety of weapon systems were developed and implemented. door gunners also tried new tactics. Leaning out on the skids, they would fire underneath the gunship. But this soon proved extremely dangerous.
They finally gave us some harnesses to wear so we wouldn't fall out of the choppers. So it was the beginning, you know. It was not like nobody had ever done it before, but no one had ever been in a combat situation where we had to lean out of a helicopter almost upside down. And I can't tell you the number of times I'd fallen out and they'd pull me up.
Eventually, M6 quad machine guns were mounted on a turret and fired by the co-pilot, while some Hueys were armed with the lethal 7.62 minigun, manned by the door gunner that could fire up to 4,000 rounds per minute. On regular missions, an average of 2 Huey gunships escorted a force of 8 slicks. Gunships never carried troops, needing to give all available cabin space to weapons and ammunition. More muscle was also added by incorporating various rocket pod combinations.
24 on a pod on one side, 24 on a pod on the other side. When we first got over there, we would try to shoot like 4 at a time. And we didn't have the accuracy with 4. And if you shot all 48, you'd back up 20 feet and scare the hell out of you because you feel like you're falling down. But we could shoot 2 at a time with pinpoint accuracy.
As the war in Vietnam escalated, many in the US military felt the unique qualities of the Huey could be used to form a well-armed mobile force that could respond rapidly to enemy operations. In July 1965, a new unit, the 1st Air Cavalry Division, equipped with nearly 500 helicopters, arrived in Vietnam to begin the longest tour of duty in American combat history. The Air Cavalry was specifically designed to perform classic cavalry missions, riding quickly to battle, in a helicopter instead of on a horse. They were the only division in the world whose units were trained to work with and depend solely on the helicopter. Tactics were pioneered by the 1st Squadron 9th Cavalry Regiment under the command of the flamboyant Colonel Jim Stockton.
John Stockton was an outstanding cavalryman to begin with. Because of the training that he gave the squadron before they deployed, right from the beginning, they were an outstanding unit in combat against the enemy. I personally feel he's the father of air cavalry. When I took over the squadron, I just built upon what he had already trained into the squadron.
If you were in the 1st Cav, you were in a special unit. You were making history. You were doing something that no one had ever done before. This wasn't like hitting a beach. This was flying a flying machine that no one had ever fought a war with, and it was a piece of history. I don't ever remember any bad morale, ever.
Equipped with Hueys, the Air Cavalry immediately went on the offensive. Their mission, to search out and destroy the enemy.
The Huey was our horse. I mean, we rode it right through the war. It took us everywhere we wanted to go.
As in the horse cavalry of old, air cavalry commanders were expected to lead from the front.
Every troop commander was a pilot. I wanted to be intimately knowledgeable of what was going on the ground, in the LZ as well as around the LZ. I never did see how a commander at any level could be really on top of everything unless he was right in the middle of it.
The air cavalry used scout helicopters to search for signs of the enemy. Once contact was made, the well-armed squadron swept out of the sky, destroying the opposition with its massive firepower.
We were very lethal. I mean, the VC hated us. They hated us because we could see them and we could blow the hell out of everything we saw. We had enough firepower.
In a matter of months, the air cavalry and their battle-ready Hueys had earned a reputation as aggressive fighters. But as the demands of the Vietnam War changed daily and the pressure increased on helicopter crews, the Huey would be forced to take on multiple roles. It was well on its way to going from workhorse to legend. The war in Vietnam was one in which the speed of deployment of men and firepower was vital. By 1966, 500,000 American and 750,000 South Vietnamese were fighting in South Vietnam. the Huey had become a crucial element in the logistic support of these men. In addition to regular combat sorties, the Hueys would also fly ash and trash missions, the routine fetch and carry duties that were part and parcel of supporting US and South Vietnamese forces.
Slicks would fly 2 to 3 times as many hours as gunships. When gunships went out, they went out to kill people. We went out every day to do everything imaginable. Literally, you're carrying people and anything that needs to be carried.
The demands of war meant Hueys often transported loads that far exceeded their normal weight limitations. The flying skills of the pilots were pushed to the limit.
We load them till they would not hover. And we used the springs in the skids to a lot of times just pick it up as you were sliding, get it up about 1.5 feet and then drop it. And bang it, and you'd use the recoil off the skids to pop it into the air.
The damp, tropical climate of Vietnam often hampered ground support of the helicopter fleets. The highly trained ground crews sweltered in the heat of summer and endured the cold downpours of the seasonal monsoon rains. Rotor blades had to be constantly changed, their surfaces eroded by the sandblasting from fine dust during takeoffs. The Huey's blades were originally expected to last 1,000 flight hours, but in Vietnam, this dropped down to 200 hours. The combination of the climate and the demands of war caused heavy wear and tear on the Hueys.
Every 25 flying hours, they would go into maintenance for a pretty basic inspection. And if you're flying a lot, that's about every third day. At 100 hours, it was a periodic inspection that was much more thorough. And every 300 hours, the engine had to be overhauled.
To keep the weight down, the Huey was made of light materials, which made it vulnerable to small arms fire.
A helicopter is made of aluminum and plexiglass. The aluminum is so thin that you could shoot through it with a .22 caliber bullet. We wore an armored plate on our chest, and we were sitting in armored seats, but your lower half of your body is totally exposed. Your entire head is exposed, and then there's parts hanging out, of course, that are exposed.
Being hit by enemy fire was a constant threat on every mission.
In case the pilot and co-pilot got shot, there's a red handle down the back of their seats that we can pull, and whichever one we need to roll out of the seat literally falls back. We can pull the body out, jump in there, fold the seat up, and fly it.
Hueys were one of the biggest threats to the communists, and every opportunity was taken to shoot them down. But it wasn't crashing that the Huey pilots feared. It was the Viet Cong.
The instructions were to kill all helicopter pilots. There was a $25,000 gold reward on any helicopter pilot, and they wanted them dead.
We did so much damage to them. They considered us to be the mortal enemy because they'd seen what we'd done to them with those Gatling guns. It was hard for them. Unless they had a deep hole to get into, those things would really do a trick when you had them working. And they hated us.
In addition to the myriad of roles taken on by the Huey, it was also designed to be a medical evacuation helicopter. The medevac missions were known as dust-off by the troops. Dust-off units were autonomous and consisted of 6 Hueys working within a specific geographical area. Each Huey had pilot, co-pilot, and 2 medics, one also acting as crew chief. The bravery of these crews was legendary. The dedication of the pilots was exemplified by Michael Novosel, a Congressional Medal of Honor winner.
If you've flown just one mission where you saved a life, why, it sort of grows on you. It's catchy. It's almost narcotic. you realize that you have this ability to help. Sometimes that really and truly you're extending a man's life.
Not all Army pilots could fly Medevac Hueys, which were equipped with advanced flying instruments.
Most of the pilots at that point of the war were not instrument qualified. In the dust-off business, because of the nature of the missions, flying under instrument conditions was absolutely necessary when the weather closed in and the job had to be done.
In Vietnam, 51% of combat casualties were due to small arms fire. 10,000 US servicemen lost a limb to booby traps and mines. It was, therefore, a huge boost to troop morale to know that they could be evacuated from the battlefield to an Army hospital in an average of 100 minutes. Of the 390,000 Army wounded transported during the war, 90% survived. Much of the credit for this success was due to the rapid response of the dust-off crews. By late 1967, the American forces had steadily closed in on the Viet Cong. But the Communists were about to launch an ambitious new offensive they hoped would turn the tide of the war. The legendary attack would stretch the Huey and its crews to the limit. Early 1968, the Communists were preparing to launch a major offensive against South Vietnam that would provide the greatest challenge to the Huey and its crews to date. Their aim was to spark an uprising to coincide with Tet, the traditional Vietnamese New Year, and topple the government. They hoped this mass destruction would force the Americans to rethink their policy and withdraw from Vietnam. On January the 30th, 84,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars mounted simultaneous attacks in more than 100 towns and cities.
I was one of the few helicopter pilots in the air when the Tet Offensive started. And we'd been up on a Firefly mission, 2 gunships and a slick with about 12 landing lights hooked up to shine down on the river and catch their sampans as they moved supplies through. So we looked up and we actually thought they set off a nuclear bomb on our home base.
Many of the helicopter units were taken by complete surprise.
They probably took out 3 or 4 of our Hueys just from mortar hits. We had 6 flyable gunships out of 8. They went up. When they came back that day, we had non-legally flyable. They were shot full of holes. We got the other 2 up, and about 3 days later, none of the 8 were legally flyable.
The Americans and South Vietnamese were stunned by the scale of the offensive.
We went out and put a strike in, and then we couldn't find a place to refuel because every place was under attack. And so anyway, I wound up refueling right in the middle of a firefight. And they actually quit shooting as I landed on this runway, and we just put in enough to knock the fuel light off.
The Tet Offensive was the first time the US forces fought large numbers of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in face-to-face combat. In the cities and in the countryside, every inch of ground was bitterly contested. Casualties on both sides mounted. Huey crews were pushed to the limit as they flew double their usual number of missions. There was no front line in Vietnam, and the Allies used their superior air mobility to transport reinforcements to the numerous battles raging around the country. Although Tet was a great propaganda coup for the Viet Cong, they suffered massive losses as a consequence. 32,000 were killed in the first 2 weeks, against 3,000 South Vietnamese and 1,000 Americans. The Tet Offensive revealed how vital air mobility was to American strategy. Without the Huey, the speedy movement of troops around Vietnam's treacherous terrain would have been impossible. The Huey was to remain the key element in all future campaigns, American commanders realized cohesive action by aircrew and helicopter-borne infantry on combat assaults was essential if the communist forces were to be contained. Careful operational planning would also minimize losses. Once the Hueys reached the battle zone, they would circle for 10 minutes, during which the Air Force would strike. The gunships would then unleash their weapons into enemy positions near the landing zone.
As soon as the Huey would come in, we'd drop our loads into 2 to 4 rockets at a time, and we'd peel out. And the crew chief on the left would lean out on the skids and shoot everywhere that we're flying into, and I would lean out on the skids on the other side with, up like this, and I'd shoot everything behind us so that they couldn't shoot us as we were pulling out. And the next chopper would come in and be doing the same thing.
A colored smoke grenade was dropped to mark the landing zone. This technique of using different colors was adopted to avoid the enemy laying down its own smoke as a decoy. Slicks descended in a stepped formation, each one at about 45 degrees to the side and rear of the leader, high enough to avoid rotor wash.
When you're going into an LZ, it's unbelievable how the turbulence works. In other words, to put a helicopter down on the ground, you have to have an air cushion. And when the turbulence is churning off the helicopters in front of you, it blows the cushion out from under you, and it's like a controlled crash. And you best know what you're doing, or you're fixing to bang it into the rice paddies.
As the Hueys flew in, the Viet Cong concentrated their fire on the approaching helicopters.
You are under anti-aircraft cannon at high level, and at low level you are under AK-47. And when you land on the landing zone, you are under artillery or mortar fire. That's a 3-layer of fire you encounter, and it is very dangerous. And that is the sitting target for the enemy.
The confusion that just reigns supreme in a person's mind during your first combat assault is just beyond description. There are bombs going off, rockets going off, there are gunships flying by, the M60s start chattering, the ground is burning, people on board are there's a murmuring you can hear in back, and you know they're excited about the landing. And it's just so much total confusion and total chaos that I don't think there's any type of training that can really prepare you for that.
The first troops on the ground secured the landing zone, while the Slicks departed for the refueling points to await orders for their return. If necessary, the gunships would continue to support the ground troops. The sheer ferocity of combat in Vietnam meant little quarter was given or expected. The Huey had proved itself on the battlefield time and again. It allowed the infantry to do its job against a determined and brave adversary. Even against overwhelming firepower, the Viet Cong were prepared to fight on at any cost.
A lot of people looked at them as gooks in pajamas. They were extremely talented soldiers. They were a tough soldier to fight. And they fought as hard for their country as we were fighting for our country's principles. They were damn good soldiers.
The superior air mobility of the U.S. forces had helped defeat the Viet Cong in the Tet Offensive. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a series of communist supply routes winding through the jungle, was still open. Supported by Hueys, American Special Forces teams were deployed to search out and destroy this vital Viet Cong lifeline.
Sometimes we would just insert an American Special Forces unit. A lot of times their mission was to interdict traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to put sensors out, sometimes to kidnap a North Vietnamese officer to gain intelligence and to take captives.
When landings were impossible, Special Forces units such as the Green Berets or Rangers would parachute into action. Sometimes they would swing down on 120-foot ropes in a technique known as rappelling. Secrecy was the key to successful operations. Because of the rotor noise, pilots tried to avoid alerting the enemy until the last possible moment.
You can't tell always where a sound is coming from. And the same is true with a helicopter. You can hear it, but you're not quite sure where it is. And if you stay close to the treetops, it's much harder to see one. And when you do see it, it's in your vision for a much shorter period of time, so it's hard to get a bead on it. And so we would generally stay pretty close to treetop level.
The U.S. Navy also began to fly a special squadron of Hueys, nicknamed the Sea Wolves. Their task was to keep the waterways of the Mekong Delta open and free from the enemy. The Sea Wolves protected Navy river patrol boats by searching for sampans laden with weapons and ammunition for the Viet Cong. The Mekong Delta was a vital link in the Viet Cong supply line. Patrolling this large network of waterways was risky. The possibility of ambush was a constant danger. The reputation of the Sea Wolves pilots for pinpoint navigation in poor weather conditions meant they were in constant demand by the U.S. Navy SEALs and other Special Forces groups. On August the 29th, 1969, Daniel Kelly was on a mission to drop Special Forces into the Delta area when his Huey came under sustained fire.
We no sooner dropped them off than everything just went nuts. I mean, just enemy fire everywhere. And we kept circling around low level to try to suppress the enemy fire so we could pick these guys back up again. We flew through this one clearing as we were making our third round, and it was like they had us set up. They were waiting for us. All the plexiglass was shot out of the helicopter. All the instruments were shot out. Had so many bullets went through that helicopter, my ICS cord was shot in half. So nobody knew I even got hit. And I ended up having to take a spare barrel and hit my gunner on top of the head to get his attention. As soon as I got hit, it was like a giant water balloon of blood just exploded all over the helicopter.
With Kelly seriously wounded, the stricken Huey managed to struggle back to base.
As soon as the helicopter sat down, they already had a tourniquet on my leg, what was left of it. The engine died. All the fuel and oil lines going into the jet engine had been shot off. We flew for about 15 minutes with no fuel or oil going to that jet engine. Could not explain it even to this day.
As a result of his injuries, Daniel Kelly had to have his leg amputated above the knee. But without the Huey, he would have lost his life. The robustness of the Huey and courage of its crews continued to save lives throughout the war. Michael Novosel had already been flying for 7 hours on a series of medevac missions when he received an urgent request to evacuate wounded South Vietnamese soldiers from the Cambodian border.
We have a mission that we really don't have to take because these were all Vietnamese troops, no American on the ground, no covering fire, no one to talk with, and no way of determining who's enemy, who's friend.
Despite ferocious small arms fire, Novosel skillfully positioned his Huey for landing.
Skidding over the ground in the contact area where I'm surrounded by the enemy also. Never stopping, but only moving, and as the wounded stood up, they were yanked on board by either the crew chief or the medic, depending on which side of the aircraft they were on.
Novosel dropped the wounded at a medical station and returned for more soldiers. Over the next 2.5 hours, he flew into the area 15 times. He was forced to abort twice and refuel 3 times. As Novosel maneuvered to pick up the last wounded man, a Viet Cong fired his automatic weapon at point-blank range.
And he emptied out his AK at me personally. Of course, he couldn't have done that without hitting me, so I was hit above the knee and below the knee and in the hand. And the reaction caused me to lose control. The aircraft jumped into the air, and skewed off to one side.
The co-pilot took control at that critical moment and nursed the Huey back to friendly territory. For his selfless act of courage, Michael Novosel was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Every one of the 29 that we saved was wounded to some degree or other. Most of them had severe wounds, but they could not have lived throughout the night. And I'm sure the Viet Cong wouldn't have permitted them to anyhow.
Despite the Huey and the success of air operations, it became clear Vietnam was a war that could not be won. Public opinion had turned against American involvement.
We won all the battles. We did. Politics lost the war.
Although the American presence in Vietnam officially ended in 1973, the Huey continued to fly with the South Vietnamese Army. But without American support, the end of South Vietnam seemed inevitable.
After the American withdrawal, we flew only 2 or 3 missions a day. The reason is we lack of spare part, component, and even fuel. The artillery can only fire 4 rounds a day. We can only bring very serious wounded soldiers back to hospital. The minor one, we just leave them on the battlefield.
In April 1975, South Vietnam finally fell to the victorious communists. The long and bitter conflict was finally over. But the Huey's performance during the war became legendary. Over the course of 11 years, more than 7,000 Hueys were deployed in Vietnam, flying a staggering 36 million sorties.
The Vietnam War was the Huey War. It was not a ground war. It was a helicopter war.
Of the 58,000 American servicemen killed in the Vietnam War, 4,900 were helicopter crews. To the men who lived and fought their war in helicopters, the Huey remains something special.
I think of the Huey as my best friend. We spent a lot of time together, and he was always good to me, and I tried to be good to him.
Huey was a fantastic machine. It was beautiful. It would take you into the worst kind of hell you could go into, and almost always bring you back home to where you were safe.
I evacuated 5,589 wounded, flew 2,028 hours of combat, all in the Huey, and it never let me down.